In this presentation, we will highlight elements found in Parts 1 and 2 of this training. We will also go into detailed coverage of all exceptions. To review, prior art includes that which is patented, described in a printed publication, in public use, on sale, or otherwise available to the public, or described in a patent issued under Section 151 or in an application for patent published or deemed published under Section 122B, in which the patent or application, as the case may be, names another inventor and was effectively filed before the effective filing date of the claimed invention. Prior art is used to determine whether claimed subject matter lacks novelty or is obvious, thereby being one basis for evidence of unpatentability. Different bases apply to rejections under Sections 101 and 112, and those are covered in other modules. Rejections under 35 U.S.C. 102 use prior art as evidence that a claimed invention lacks novelty and is therefore unpatentable. Thus, making a complete search and applying prior art properly is an essential part of the overall examination process. This module focuses on identifying which prior art can and cannot be applied under 35 U.S.C. 102. A determination of whether it is appropriate to apply prior art using 35 U.S.C. 102A1 or 35 U.S.C. 102A2 is aided by a three-step process. First, determine whether the reference qualifies as prior art under 35 U.S.C. 102A1 or A2. Second, review the application file to determine if any exception under 35 U.S.C. 102B1 or B2 applies. Finally, if the reference qualifies and no exception applies, verify whether the reference anticipates the claim language, which means each claim limitation is either explicitly or inherently disclosed. 35 U.S.C. 102 A1 and A2 were covered in previous modules. This module will focus on the exceptions to 102A under 102B. 102A1 states, "A person shall be entitled to a patent unless the claimed invention was patented, described in a printed publication, or in public use, on sale, or otherwise available to the public before the effective filing date of the claimed invention." What's important about 102A1 prior art is that it must have been available to the public in order to be used in a rejection. 102A1 disclosures may be prior art as of their public accessibility date. Remember, 102A1 precludes patentability of a claimed invention when the claimed invention was patented, described in a printed publication, or in public use, on sale, or otherwise available to the public before the effective filing date of the claimed invention. The graphic on this slide shows this visually. So, what exceptions apply to 102A1? Even though you find a disclosure that appears to apply under 102A1, that disclosure will not be considered prior art under 102A1 if one of the exceptions in 102B1 applies. There are two exceptions, 102B1A and 102B1B. Both involve potential prior art disclosures that were made in the one-year period preceding the effective filing date of the claimed invention. That one-year period is known as the grace period. Note that exceptions under 102B1 apply exclusively to 102A1 prior art, not to 102A2 prior art. We will begin by looking at just the first part of 102B1, which says, a disclosure made 1 year or less before the effective filing date of a claimed invention shall not be prior art to the claimed invention under subsection A1 if A. The disclosure was made by the inventor or joint inventor, or by another who obtained the subject matter disclosed directly or indirectly from the inventor or a joint inventor. The 102B1A exception involves inventor-originated disclosures during the grace period. By inventor-originated disclosure, we mean a disclosure by the inventive entity or the inventor, one or more joint inventors, or another who obtained the disclosed subject matter from the inventor or a joint inventor either directly or indirectly. Note that inventor, as defined in the AIA 35 U.S.C. 100F, means the entire inventive entity. In this most basic example of 102B1A, we are examining an application from Al, Bob, and Cy that includes a claimed invention having an effective filing date of May 1st, 2015. During our search, we find an anticipatory disclosure with a date prior to May 1st, 2015, but on or after May 1st, 2014. Thus, the disclosure is within the grace period for the claimed invention. We also note that the disclosure is by the inventive entity, Al, Bob, and Cy. In this case, even though the anticipatory disclosure of Al, Bob, and Cy would fall within the confines of 102A1, it cannot be considered prior art because it was made during the grace period by the inventive entity. Consequently, we cannot reject the claimed invention using that disclosure. Here are 3 more examples with slight modifications to each. In all 3, the application was filed on May 1st, 2015 by Al, Bob, and Cy, so the grace period began 1 year earlier, May 1st, 2014. There are intervening disclosures present in each, and the examiner must determine if the 102B1A exception applies to the intervening disclosures. If the exception applies, then the disclosure is not prior art. In all 3, there are different modes of public disclosure: a journal article, an offer for sale, and a trade show display. The first 2 timelines show disclosures by members of the inventive entity, but not the entire inventive entity. This fulfills the requirements of the exception, so the exception applies and the disclosures are not prior art. Namely, the disclosure was within the grace period and is inventor originated because the disclosure is being made by one or more joint inventors. In the third timeline, the disclosure was not by one or more of the inventors, but it was by another who obtained the disclosed subject matter from the joint inventor, thus also fulfilling the requirements for the disclosure to meet the exception. Again, here are 3 timelines, each with an application filed by Al, Bob, and Cy on May 1st, 2015, so that the grace period began 1 year earlier on May 1st, 2014. In the first 2 timelines, there are disclosures made during the grace period, and the examiner must determine if the 102B1A exception applies. In the first timeline, the disclosure is by one of the joint inventors, Al, and also someone else, Joe. We do not know what Joe's involvement was. That is, Joe may have provided the subject matter to Al, or Al may have provided it to Joe, but neither is necessarily the case. Because there is no evidence explaining Joe's involvement, the exception does not apply, and the disclosure could be used in a prior art rejection. In the second timeline, the disclosure is made by a third party, and there is no indication that the third party obtained the disclosed subject matter from the inventor or a joint inventor, either directly or indirectly. Thus, the exception does not apply, and the disclosure could be used in a prior art rejection. In the third timeline, the examiner may quickly notice that an exception does not apply because the disclosure was before the grace period. Since the requirement of being within the grace period does not apply, it does not matter that the disclosure is by the full inventive entity. While the 102B1A exception was about inventor-originated grace period disclosures, the 102B1B exception concerns an inventor or joint inventor disclosing subject matter before it was disclosed by a third party. In context, 102B1B says, a disclosure made 1 year or less before the effective filing date of a claimed invention shall not be prior art to the claimed invention under subsection A1 if the subject matter disclosed had, before such disclosure, been publicly disclosed by the inventor or a joint inventor or another who obtained the subject matter disclosed directly or indirectly from the inventor or a joint inventor. The 102B1B exception applies to a 102A1 prior art when all three bullets are met: third-party disclosure during the grace period, inventor-originated disclosure must have been made prior to third party's disclosure, and both must have disclosed subject matter X. This may sound complicated, but it boils down to this. We're examining an application and we find a disclosure by someone who is not part of the inventive entity that occurred within the grace period for the claimed invention. We'll call this a third-party disclosure. The third-party disclosure talks about subject matter X, which falls within the scope of the claimed invention, and, therefore, the disclosure can be used to reject the claimed invention under 102A1. The exception under 102B1B would apply when there is evidence that there was an even earlier public disclosure of subject matter X by the inventor or a joint inventor or another. In the context of this discussion of 102B1B, we should be clear that when we are talking about another, we mean someone who disclosed subject matter that was obtained directly or indirectly from one or more members of the inventive entity. This is in contrast to our use of third party, which refers to someone who disclosed subject matter but did not obtain it directly or indirectly from a member of the inventive entity. This timeline shows the most basic application of the 102B1B exception. The claimed invention of Al, Bob, and Cy has an effective filing date of May 1st, 2015. We find a disclosure of Ty that teaches subject matter X, which anticipates the claimed invention. Ty, in this case, is a third party, meaning he did not obtain the subject matter X from Al, Bob, and/or Cy. Consequently, the disclosure of Ty meets the requirements of 102A1. But because we know that Al, Bob, and Cy disclosed subject matter X prior to Ty's disclosure would not be considered prior art because of the 102B1B exception. But what about the earlier disclosure of subject matter X by Al, Bob, and Cy? Doesn't it meet the requirements of 102A1? It does, but it cannot be considered prior art because the 102(b)(1)(a) exception applies to this disclosure, since it was by the inventive entity and within the grace period. In all of these timelines, the effective filing date is May 1st, 2015, and there is a third-party disclosure of subject matter X. Because the third-party disclosure is during the grace period, it may be subject to a 35 U.S.C. 102(b)(1) exception. However, it is not a 102(b)(1)(a) exception because it is not an inventor-originated disclosure. That is, it's not by one or more joint inventors, the inventive entity, or another who obtained the disclosed subject matter from the inventor or a joint inventor, either directly or indirectly. Ty, who is not an inventor, discloses the subject matter X, and there is no reason to believe Ty obtained the disclosed subject matter, indirectly or directly, from the inventor or a joint inventor. Next, we turn to exception 102(b)(1)(b). As noted previously, this exception requires that there exist an inventor-originated disclosure that was made prior to the third party's disclosure, wherein both disclose the subject matter X. In the first timeline, Bob's disclosure of subject matter X prior to Ty's disclosure causes the 102(b)(1)(b) exception to apply, so that Ty's disclosure cannot be used as prior art. In the second timeline, Dee's disclosure, since she obtained subject matter X from Bob, causes the 102(b)(1)(b) exception to apply, so that Ty's disclosure cannot be used as prior art. In the third timeline, Ty's disclosure is not prior art because the 102(b)(1)(b) exception applies. However, Bob's disclosure itself is prior art to the claimed invention since it's before the grace period. Note that the only difference in the first and third timelines is the timing of Bob's disclosure. Please remember that while the inventor-originated disclosure needs to be prior to the third party's disclosure, the inventor-originated disclosure itself can be during or before the grace period, and that any disclosure of subject matter X before the grace period is not subject to the exceptions and is likely to be prior art. No exception applies to any disclosure before the grace period, even if the subject matter was obtained from a member of the inventive entity. We use the term shield to describe how, with the 102(b)(1)(b) exception, an inventor-originated prior public disclosure can protect the claimed invention from a third party's disclosure that might otherwise be prior art. While the same subject matter must be disclosed under 102(b)(1)(b) in order for the exception to apply, the inventor-originated disclosure and the third party's intervening disclosure need not be made in the same manner. Also, the two disclosures need not use identical words, figures, tables, or other forms of expressions. Obviousness is not the standard for determining whether something is the same subject matter for the purpose of applying this exception. In other words, if the subject matter disclosed in the prior inventor-originated disclosure must be modified in some way in order to arrive at the subject matter disclosed, then the two disclosures do not disclose the same subject matter. If only a portion of a third party's intervening disclosure is shielded by previously disclosed same subject matter in an inventor-originated disclosure, this does not affect the availability of the remainder of the intervening disclosure, which may still be available as prior art. The question of whether a shield applies will ordinarily come up after the examiner has conducted a search and applied a reference in an office action. In response, the applicant could submit a declaration asserting that the reference cannot be applied as 102A1 prior art because the 102B1B exception applies. Thus, the question to ask when considering whether a shield applies is, what subject matter of the third party's intervening disclosure is found in a previous inventor-originated public disclosure? Comparing the claimed invention to either the inventor's prior disclosure or the third party's intervening disclosure is not proper when considering whether the 102B1B exception applies. Some illustrations of how the 102B1B exception applies are shown in the next few slides. If an inventor makes a disclosure of subject matter, for example, a flathead screw, as in the first entry on this table, then a third party's later grace period disclosure of a general category that includes the subject matter, for example, a screw, cannot be used as prior art. In other words, the inventor's disclosure is effective as a shield against the third party's grace period disclosure, which might otherwise be prior art. In this circumstance, we conclude that the inventor has previously disclosed the subject matter of the third party's grace period disclosure. In the second example, both the inventor and the third party have disclosed a flathead screw. The third party has disclosed some other kinds of screw as well. When considering whether the third party's disclosure of flathead screws can be used as prior art, we can answer yes to the question of whether the inventor had already publicly disclosed that subject matter. Thus, the shield partially applies, and no rejection can be made based on the disclosure of flathead screws. However, the inventor had not previously disclosed Phillips head screws or hex head screws. Therefore, if these disclosures by the third party are relevant to the claimed invention, they may be used as prior art. At the bottom of the slide, we see an example in which the third party has disclosed a flathead screw, while the inventor had previously disclosed only the general category of screws. Because the inventor had not previously disclosed flathead screws, either inherently or explicitly, the shield does not apply. If applicable, an examiner could use the third party's disclosure of flathead screws as prior art against the claimed invention. This slide illustrates the same concept as the previous slide, but uses examples more familiar to chemical examiners. In the first example on this slide, the third party's grace period disclosure is just a general category, alkyl, that would encompass the species, methyl, previously disclosed by the inventor. In other words, the inventor's disclosure is a more detailed and specific disclosure than that of the third party. In this situation, we conclude that the inventor has previously disclosed the subject matter of the third party's grace period disclosure. The inventor's prior disclosure acts as a shield, and the third party's disclosure of a general category cannot be used as prior art against the inventor's claimed invention. In the second example, the third party has specifically disclosed methyl, as well as ethyl and propyl, within the inventor's grace period. The inventor's previous disclosure of methyl shields his claimed invention from the prior art effect of the third party's disclosure of methyl. However, the claimed invention is not shielded as to the third party's disclosure of ethyl and propyl, even if ethyl and propyl would have been obvious over methyl. If appropriate to the claimed invention, the examiner may use the third party's disclosure of ethyl and propyl as prior art. The last example shows a situation in which the third party has disclosed the species methyl during the inventor's grace period. Although the inventor had previously disclosed a general category, alkyl, into which the species methyl would fall, and thus a generic disclosure, the inventor has not disclosed the same subject matter as the third party. Therefore, the shield does not apply, and the examiner is permitted to use the third party's disclosure of the species in a prior art rejection. our attention to 35 U.S.C. 102(a)(2) and its possible exceptions. Recall that the statute mentions three kinds of U.S. patent documents that may be prior art under 102(a)(2). Patents issued under Section 151, patent applications published under Section 122B, and patent applications deemed published under Section 122B. We will take a look at each of these on the next slide. When we refer to U.S. patent documents in the 102(a)(2) training materials, we mean one of these three categories. You are familiar with U.S. patents and PG pubs. For WIPO publications, recall that the international filing date of a WIPO publication that designates the United States is the U.S. filing date of the application. In this sense, WIPO publications that designate the United States are U.S. patent documents. Be aware that foreign patent documents, for example, JP or GB patents or published applications, cannot be prior art as of their filing date under 102(a)(2). However, they may be printed publication prior art under 102(a)(1). Here we have a basic timeline for 102(a)(2). To qualify as a reference under 102(a)(2), the U.S. patent document must have an effectively filed date that precedes the effectively filed date of the claimed invention. It does not matter if the U.S. patent document is published after the effective filing date of the claimed invention. Even though a U.S. patent document describes the claimed invention in accordance with 102(a)(2), the document is not prior art if one of the exceptions stated in 102(b)(2) applies. The three exceptions are stated in 102(b)(2)(a), 102(b)(2)(b), and 102(b)(2)(c). Unlike the 102(b)(1) exceptions that apply to 102(a)(1) disclosures, the 102(b)(2) exceptions do not involve the 1-year grace period. Now let's discuss the 102(b)(2)(a) exception. A disclosure shall not be prior art to a claimed invention under subsection 102(a)(2) if A. The subject matter disclosed was obtained directly or indirectly from the inventor or a joint inventor. Under the 102(b)(2)(a) exception, a 102(a)(2) reference is not prior art as of the effectively filed date if the subject matter disclosed was obtained from one or more members of the inventive entity, either directly or indirectly. The 102(b)(2)(a) exception is a lot like the 102(b)(1)(a) exception. Both have to do with disclosures of material that originated with the inventor or a joint inventor. Also, the phrase, "the subject matter disclosed," means the same under 102(b)(2)(a) as it did in 102(b)(1)(a). In each timeline, we have an application under examination in which Al, Bob, and Cy are the inventor. In other words, the inventor is collectively Al, Bob, and Cy. Remember, under the AIA, the term inventor means the inventive entity. Each timeline shows a different U.S. published application in blue as a possible 102(a)(2) prior art reference. Those who filed the applications invented the subject matter disclosed. We are considering whether the 102(b)(2)(a) exception applies. If the exception applies, the disclosure is not prior art. In all three timelines, U.S. applications were filed before the effective filing date of Al, Bob, and Cy's claimed invention. In the first illustration, Al is a joint inventor of the application under examination, so the exception under 102(b)(2)(b) applies. and Al's earlier application is not prior art as of its filing date to the invention claimed by Al, Bob, and Cy. In the second illustration, D is not a joint inventor of the application under examination, but she did obtain the subject matter directly from the inventor. Therefore, the exception under 102(b)(2)(b) applies, and D's earlier application is not prior art as of its filing date to the invention claimed by Al, Bob, and Cy. In the third illustration, Ed is not a joint inventor of the application under examination, but he did obtain the subject matter indirectly, via Fay, from a joint inventor, Bob. Therefore, the exception under 102(b)(2)(b) applies, and Ed's earlier application is not prior art as of its filing date to the invention claimed by Al, Bob, and Cy. Now let's discuss 102(b)(2)(b), which concerns a shielding disclosure by the inventor or a joint inventor and is like the 102(b)(1)(b) exception for 102(a)(1) references. In context, that statute says, "A disclosure shall not be prior art to a claimed invention under subsection A2 if b. The subject matter disclosed had, before such subject matter was effectively filed under subsection A2, been publicly disclosed by the inventor or a joint inventor or another who obtained the subject matter disclosed directly or indirectly from the inventor or a joint inventor." The 102(b)(2)(b) exception applies to a 102(a)(2) prior art when all three bullets are met. The third-party disclosure was effectively filed before the effective filing date of the claimed invention. The inventor-originated disclosure must have been made prior to third parties' effectively filed date of their disclosure, and both must have disclosed subject matter X. Here's the most basic version of how this exception applies. In this example, before Al, Bob, and Cy filed a patent application, third-party Ty filed a U.S. patent application disclosing subject matter X. This would appear to qualify Ty's U.S. patent application as prior art. However, note that before Ty's patent application filing, Al, Bob, and Cy publicly disclosed subject matter X. Thus, the 102(b)(2)(b) exception exists because Al, Bob, and Cy's previous public disclosure of subject matter X shields their claimed invention from third-party Ty's U.S. patent application disclosure of that subject matter. In other words, the exception under 102(b)(2)(b) applies. Now we move to the final exception, 102(b)(2)(c). A disclosure shall not be prior art to a claimed invention under subsection 102(a)(2) if c. The subject matter disclosed and the claimed invention, not later than the effective filing date of the claimed invention, were owned by the same person or subject to an obligation of assignment to the same person. This provides an exception to prior art for subject matter disclosed in U.S. patent documents that was commonly owned with the claimed invention, not later than the effective filing date of the claimed invention. This exception applies to U.S. patent documents which may potentially be 102(a)(2) prior art as of their effectively filed date. It has no counterpart for 102(a)(1) disclosures, which may be prior art as of their public accessibility date. In order for the 102(b)(2)(c) exception to apply, the subject matter of the potential 102(a)(2) reference and the claimed invention must satisfy one of the following three conditions not later than the effective filing date of the claimed invention. 1. both owned by the same person, or 2, both subject to an obligation of assignment to the same person, or 3, both deemed to have been owned by or subject to an obligation of assignment to the same person. Note that if this exception applies, a U.S. patent document cannot be used as 102A2 prior art as of its effectively filed date, but it may still be used as 102A1 prior art as of its publication or patent date. Section 102C, which is reproduced here, broadens the reach of the 102B2C exception by providing that subject matter developed under a joint research agreement may be deemed to have been commonly owned with the claimed invention. Note the full language of 102C provided in the slide. Subject matter developed under a joint research agreement, or JRA, will be treated as commonly owned with the claimed invention under examination for purposes of 102B2C when 3 conditions are satisfied. The first condition is multifaceted, and thus there are really 5 questions to answer. First, timing. Was the JRA in effect not later than the effective filing date of the claimed invention? Second, 2 questions of who. Did one or more parties to the JRA develop the subject matter disclosed in a potential prior art U.S. patent document? And did one or more parties to the JRA make the claimed invention? Fourth, what? Was the claimed invention made as a result of activities within the scope of the JRA? And finally, a formality. Does the application that includes the claimed invention name, or will it be amended to name, the parties to the JRA? Typically, an examiner is not aware of the 102B2C exception at the time of the first office action, but the applicant will reveal it as a basis for overcoming a rejection. In each of these examples, Bob, the inventor of the instant application, and D need not have invented the same subject matter. In the first timeline, D's application is owned by the same person or entity as Bob's, so the exception applies. Bob's assignment to Acme may have occurred at any time up to the effective filing date of Bob's claimed invention. In the second timeline, Bob is under contractual obligation to assign the invention to the same person who owns D's invention, so the exception applies. Bob's contractual obligation to assign may have occurred at any time up to the effective filing date of Bob's claimed invention. In the third timeline, Bob is a party to a JRA with D, who is named as a party to the JRA in his application. His claimed invention is a result of activities within the scope of the JRA. Thus, the exception applies. The subject matter of D's application need not have been within the scope of the joint research agreement. The joint research agreement may have been entered into as late as the effective filing date of Bob's claimed invention. On the other hand, in the first illustration shown on this slide, Bob's claimed invention and the subject matter in D's application were not commonly owned until after the effective filing date of Bob's claimed invention. Thus, the common ownership exception does not apply. If D's application is published and no other exception applies, it may be used as prior art against Bob's claimed invention as of its effectively filed date. In the second illustration, even though the joint research agreement was directed toward Bob's claimed invention, the common ownership exception does not apply because the application does not name the parties to the joint research agreement. If the specification is amended to name the parties, then the exception would apply. In the third illustration, the common ownership exception does not apply because Bob's claimed invention XYZ was not within the scope of the joint research agreement between Bob and Dee, which was directed toward invention ABC. The 102(b)(2)(c) exception and the pre-AIA 103(c) exception are similar, but with the following differences. First, 102(b)(2)(c) applies to anticipation and obviousness rejections, while the pre-AIA 103(c) exception applies only to obviousness rejections in which the prior art qualifies only under pre-AIA 102(e), F, or G. Second, common ownership under AIA must exist no later than the effective filing date, but in pre-AIA, the 103(c) exception requires common ownership as of the date that the claimed invention was made. Note that under both pre-AIA and AIA practice, a statement is sufficient and a declaration is not needed to establish common ownership. An examiner may make a legitimate rejection, and thereafter, in the applicant's response, it may be demonstrated that there was an applicable exception, or the applicant may invoke an exception in the response. We'll now look at ways of invoking the exception using declarations under 37 CFR 1.130. There are two basic kinds of declarations. First, 1.130A is used to show that the potential prior art disclosure was the work of the inventor or a joint inventor to invoke exceptions under either 102(b)(1)A or 102(b)(2)A. Second, 1.130B is used to show that a third party's potential prior art disclosure was preceded by an inventor-originated disclosure of the same subject matter to invoke exceptions under either 102(b)(1)B or 102(b)(2)B. When you, as the examiner, are searching prior art and reviewing the record, you may find that it is clear on the record that an exception applies. Generally, unless the record is clear that an exception applies, you must make or maintain an applicable rejection. But when the record is clear or becomes clear that an exception applies, then do not make or maintain any rejection under 102(a)(1) or 102(a)(2). When in doubt whether an exception applies, make the rejection and develop the record. Shown here are two examples of when the examiner would not need to make a 102(a)(1) rejection because an exception clearly applies based on the existing record. In other words, an examiner should not require a declaration to invoke an exception. In the first example, the potential prior art disclosure is by the inventor or a joint inventor and does not name anyone else. In the second example, the potential prior art disclosure is identified in the application under examination as having been made by or having originated from the inventor or a joint inventor. Similarly, shown here are two examples of when the examiner would not need to make a 102A2 rejection because an exception clearly applies based on the existing record. In other words, an examiner would not need to require a declaration to invoke an exception. In the first example, the potential prior art disclosure is by one or more joint inventors, but not the entire inventive entity, and does not name anyone else. In the second example, the potential prior art disclosure is identified in the application under examination as having been made by or having originated from the inventor. That is an inventive entity or a joint inventor. Remember, for a disclosure to be potential prior art under 102A2, it must have a different inventive entity, that is, names another inventor. In conclusion, exceptions under 102B1 apply to prior art being applied using its public availability date under 102A1. These exceptions involve inventor-originated and third-party disclosures made during the one-year grace period. Exceptions under 102B2 apply to prior art being applied using its effectively filed date under 102A2. These exceptions also involve inventor-originated and third-party disclosures, plus commonly owned disclosures, but do not involve a one-year grace period.